Forgotten Bean, a screenplay for rural American storytelling. Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, August 2018. The sky over Chase County is the color of ash, not the soft gray of a coming rain, but the pale, washed-out white that farmers in this part of Kansas have learned to fear. The sky that offers nothing, the sky that takes. Camera drifts low across State Highway 177, past a rusted sign that reads, "Welcome to Cottonwood Falls, population 872. The tallgrass prairie rolls in every direction, and in normal years this land is one of the most quietly beautiful places in the American interior. Deep green in spring, gold in autumn, a place where the wind never fully stops and the horizon seems to breathe. But this is not a normal year. The first farm we see belongs to Dale Hutchins, 43 years old, a third-generation soybean farmer who took over his father's operation in 2004. His fields stretch nearly 800 acres north of town. They should be bursting right now. Late summer beans plump in the pod, leaves dark green and thick, but something is wrong. The plants are yellowing at the edges. The leaves curl inward like cupped hands, trying to hold something that keeps slipping through. Dale stands at the edge of his field in a sweat-stained husker cap, arms folded, jaw tight. He crouches and lifts a leaf. Underneath, a fine bronze shimmer moves. Mites, spider mites, millions of them. He drops the leaf and stands up slowly. His face says everything. A mile south, Carol Freeman's corn is worse. She's 61, widowed 3 years ago, farming with her son. The stalks on the east side of her property have begun to brown from the bottom up, as if the ground itself is burning them from below. Her son kneels in the dirt with a pocket knife, cutting open a stalk. The inside is tunneled, hollow. Corn rootworm beetles, hatched underground in the spring, eating the roots before anyone knew they were there. Carol stands with her hand over her mouth. Her son says something. She shakes her head. By the third farm, Raymond Price's place, the biggest operation in the county. 1,700 acres of modern precision agriculture, GPS-guided equipment, expensive hybrid seed contracts. The scene is almost surreal. Raymond is 55, gray-haired, the kind of man who shakes hands at the county fair with both hands and knows everyone's first name. He is standing in the middle of his field with his agronomist on speakerphone. His soybean crop has developed sudden death syndrome, a soil-borne fungal pathogen that destroys root systems, leaving the above-ground plant looking healthy until it isn't, until it collapses almost overnight. The agronomist says the word catastrophic. Raymond pulls the phone from his ear and stares at it, like it said something in a foreign language. All 3 farms, all 3 neighbors, all in crisis within the same 2-week window. The camera rises above the highway now, higher, pulling back to show the patchwork of Chase County, and one farm that looks different from the rest. It sits on the south edge of Cottonwood Falls, about 40 acres total, modest by any measure. A white farmhouse with a green metal roof, an old red barn missing one board on the north face, a vegetable garden behind the house fenced with chicken wire, and in the fields, not soybeans, not corn, something else. Low-growing plants, sprawling vine-like deep green, covered in long pods that hang heavy and full, beans, old ones, the kind of beans that almost nobody grows anymore. A woman stands in the middle of those rows, moving slowly, touching pods, counting them. She wears a wide-brimmed straw hat and a faded denim shirt. She is 74 years old and she is smiling. Her name is Margaret Jenkins, and nobody, not a single person in Cottonwood Falls, laughed harder at her than they did 6 months ago. February 2018. The Cottonwood Falls Cooperative Extension meeting is held on the second Tuesday of every month in the basement of the First Methodist Church. Folding chairs, bad coffee, fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look 10 years older. There are maybe 30 people in the room tonight, and most of them are half listening to Regional Extension Agent Ted Mobley drone through a PowerPoint presentation about new fungicide-resistant soybean varieties when Walter Jenkins raises his hand. Walter is 78. He has the kind of face that looks like it's been out in the wind for decades, because it has been. Deep-set eyes, sun-darkened skin, a voice that comes from somewhere low and deliberate. He was born on this land. He has farmed it for 50 years. In 2012, when his knees gave out and the farm debt finally climbed past what the good years could cover, he and Margaret made a choice that most people in Chase County considered long overdue. They downsized. Sold off 360 acres, kept 40, started paying down the loan. Now he and Margaret are what the farming community politely calls retired, which means they still work every single day, but nobody expects them to make money at it anymore. Walter clears his throat. "I've got a question about pole beans," he says. A few people shift in their chairs. Pole beans are a garden crop. Nobody grows pole beans commercially in Chase County. Ted Mobley lowers his clicker. "Sure, Walter, what about them?" "Specifically about the rattlesnake bean, the old heirloom. My grandfather grew it on this land starting in 1931. I've been keeping seeds in the freezer since 2004. I'm thinking about putting in a serious planting this spring." The room is quiet for a moment. Then Raymond Price, sitting in the back row with his legs stretched out and a styrofoam cup balanced on his knee, says, "Walter, how many acres you still running?" 40, and you want to plant pole beans on it." "Some of it, maybe 18 acres to start." Raymond nods slowly, the way a man nods when he's deciding whether it's worth responding at all. "Well," he says, "it's your land." The room starts quietly snickering. Not cruel exactly, more like the gentle, uncomfortable laughter of people who feel sorry for something they can't help. Walter drives home without saying much. Margaret sits in the passenger seat of their old Ford pickup with a catalogue open across her lap, making notes in the margin with a pencil. She has been researching rattlesnake beans, Phaseolus vulgaris, an heirloom variety with streaks of purple on creamy pods, a plant that does not need staking or irrigation the way modern beans do, a plant that was bred not by scientists in laboratories, but by farmers across decades of selecting the strongest survivors. "They laughed," Walter says. "I heard. You weren't there." "I know how that room sounds, Walter." He turns onto their gravel road. The headlights catch the bare fields on either side, winter flat, still frozen. "The seed bank in Missouri confirmed the germination rate is still above 70%, she says. "That's not bad for seeds stored since 2004. Raymond Price thinks we've lost our minds. Raymond Price is farming on debt so large, his bank has a reserved parking space, she says without looking up. Let him laugh. Walter almost smiles. Margaret Jenkins did not make this decision lightly, and it did not begin with the February meeting. It began in truth in the summer of 2016, when Margaret noticed something in her kitchen garden that she hadn't seen in years. She had been growing a small experimental plot of the rattlesnake bean that season, just 12 plants, from a quarter teaspoon of seeds she'd found vacuum sealed in the back of the freezer. And the plants had done something remarkable. August of 2016 was brutal in Kansas. The heat index sat above 104 degrees for 11 straight days. The county got less than a third of its normal rainfall. Margaret's tomatoes failed entirely. Her cucumbers gave up in July. Her squash produced one batch and quit. But the rattlesnake beans kept going, not just surviving, producing full pods, dark green leaves that barely wilted even on the worst days, roots that drove deep into the cracked clay subsoil in a way that her modern hybrid garden varieties simply did not. She picked up a seed catalogue that fall and spent 3 months on the phone with heirloom seed preservation societies in Missouri, Vermont, and North Carolina. She wrote 2 letters to the USDA Plant Genetic Resources Unit in Geneva, New York. She made contact with a retired agricultural historian at Kansas State University named Dr. Phyllis Okafor, who had spent her career documenting historical drought-resistant varieties that had nearly been lost during the hybrid seed revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Dr. Okafor told her that the rattlesnake bean was originally developed by indigenous farmers in the desert Southwest, traded through the Plains tribes, and adopted by early European settlers who recognized that it could handle conditions their Old World varieties could not. It had a root system twice as deep as most commercial beans. It fixed nitrogen aggressively, building soil as it grew. It had natural pest deterrents built into the oils in its leaves, something modern plant breeders had bred out in the pursuit of yield consistency. Nobody grows it anymore, Dr. Okafor told her. It's hard to harvest mechanically. The pods mature at different rates. It doesn't fit into a combine-based operation. But if you're willing to do it by hand, Mrs. Jenkins, if you're willing to work it the old way, It's one of the most resilient food plants in North American agricultural history. Margaret thanked her and hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she walked into the living room where Walter was watching the evening news and said, "We need to talk about the spring planting." The preparation. The ground in Chase County freezes solid in winter and comes back grudgingly in spring. Walter waited until the second week of March to turn the soil on their 18-acre south field. The piece of ground his grandfather had used for row crops during the Depression, ground that had been in soybeans for the past 15 years and was, by Walter's estimation, considerably depleted. He used the old John Deere 4040, a tractor that had been in service since 1981 and that Walter had kept running with second-hand parts and an intimate mechanical knowledge built up over 4 decades. Raymond Price's equipment was GPS-guided. Walter's was driven by feel. He didn't plow deep. The rattlesnake bean, he had learned from Margaret's research, preferred a prepared seedbed, but not a turned-over one. It wanted the subsoil left intact so its roots could navigate downward through established channels. Instead of the full moldboard plow, Walter ran a chisel plow that loosened without inverting, breaking up compaction without destroying the soil structure underneath. Margaret walked the field behind him, pushing a soil probe into the ground every 30 feet, reading the moisture at depth. "Drier than I'd like," she said. "Dry spring so far. Dr. Okafor said they can handle a dry spring if they get water at planting." Walter nodded. "I'll run the irrigation line from the windmill tank. One good soak at planting. After that, we let them go." Margaret pushed the probe in again. 12 inches down. Still some moisture at 12 inches. Good. That's where they want to go. They ordered seeds from 3 sources: a seed preservation non-profit in Missouri, a small family farm in New Mexico that had been growing the variety continuously since the 1940s, and from their own frozen stock, the seeds Walter's grandfather had handed down. Each batch was slightly different. Walter laid them out on the kitchen table in 3 piles and looked at them for a long time. "We should plant them mixed," he said. Margaret agreed without explanation because she knew why: genetic diversity. If the beans were all from one lineage, one vulnerability could destroy the whole planting. Mixed stock meant some would handle whatever came better than others. The strongest survivors would be obvious at harvest. Those seeds would go into the freezer for next year. They spent 3 evenings in the kitchen, inoculating the seeds with Rhizobium bacteria, a nitrogen-fixing organism that forms nodules on bean roots and feeds the plant without fertilizer. The inoculant came in a small packet from the seed company and cost $12. Margaret mixed it with water and stirred each batch of seeds until they were coated, then spread them on newspaper to dry. Walter watched her do this and thought about his grandfather doing the same thing at the same table in 1936. "You know what Raymond Price spends on synthetic nitrogen per acre?" he said. "About $250, she said. "I looked it up. We're spending $12 total. We're also doing it the way a civilization learned to do it after 10,000 years of practice," she said. So, April 14th, 2018. They planted on a Saturday, just the 2 of them. Margaret's granddaughter drove up from Wichita to help. A 26-year-old named Ashley, who had grown up spending summers on the farm and who showed up in running shoes that were not appropriate for this work and did not complain once. They used a walk-behind cedar that Walter had modified. He'd replaced the standard plate with a homemade wooden disc cut to the right spacing for the rattlesnake bean's larger seeds. The seeds wanted to go in 2 inches deep, 6 inches apart, in rows 30 inches wide, close enough to create a canopy that would shade out weeds as the summer progressed, far enough apart that the root systems wouldn't compete. Walter walked the rows. Margaret followed, dropping seeds into the opened furrow where the cedar missed. Ashley came behind with the irrigation line, flooding each row slowly, letting the water sink. It took 2 full days. On the second afternoon, Carol Freeman drove past on the county road and slowed down. She rolled down her window and watched them for a moment. "Walter," she called. "Beans?" "Rattlesnake beans," he said without stopping. A pause. "I don't know that variety." "Not many do." Another pause. "You need help with your soybean acres. Billy's got some time. We're not planting soybeans this year." Carol looked at Margaret. Margaret smiled and kept walking. Carol rolled her window back up and drove on. By sundown on the second day, all 18 acres were in. Walter stood at the top of the rise at the south edge of the field and looked down the rows. The ground was still damp from the irrigation. The furrows were straight and even. Margaret came and stood beside him. She brought a thermos of coffee. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we wait." "And watch." "And watch," he agreed. Spring 2018. Word spread the way it always does in small farm communities, slowly, thoroughly, and with embellishments. By the end of April, most of Cottonwood Falls knew that Walter and Margaret Jenkins had put their entire field acreage into some kind of antique bean that nobody had heard of. The reactions ranged from puzzled to openly amused. At the grain elevator one Friday morning, a group of farmers talking weather and prices got onto the subject. Dennis Caldwell, who ran a 600-acre corn operation west of town and had known Walter for 40 years, shook his head. "Old-timer beans," he said, "hand-harvested, on 18 acres. You know how long that's going to take to pick in August?" "If they even make it to August," said someone else. "What are they, 60 cents a pound? Dry beans at the specialty market? Maybe more if they can find the right buyer. Not more than commodity soybeans when you factor in labor." Raymond Price was there. He'd heard the story already and had refined his position since February. "Look," he said, "Walter Jenkins is a man I respect. He's been farming this county longer than half the people here have been alive. But there comes a point where sentiment isn't management. You can't run a farm on nostalgia." Nobody disagreed. At the Cottonwood Falls Diner on Main Street, Margaret overheard two women at the next table discussing them. Not unkindly, the women were genuinely concerned, the way neighbors are concerned when they think something is going wrong with people they care about. "She said they're not putting anything in but beans," one said. "Heirloom beans. Some kind of Depression-era variety. Is Walter getting, forgetful?" "I don't think so. I think it was actually Margaret's idea." A pause. "That worries me more." Margaret finished her coffee and left a good tip. What Margaret noticed. The beans germinated in 10 days. By the third week of May, the rows were clearly visible, a dense, low-growing carpet of dark green that moved slightly in the constant Kansas wind. Margaret walked the rows every morning at 6 a.m. before the heat built up. She had a clipboard and a hand lens, and she moved slowly, crouching every few feet. She was looking at the soil. Specifically, she was looking at what was happening in the soil around the base of the plants, where the mulch of dead plant material from the previous season had broken down into a fine, crumbly layer. She was looking at insect activity. What she found was not encouraging. In the first week of May, she found soybean aphid eggs on the fence posts at the edge of the field. The aphids had overwintered as eggs on nearby buckthorn shrubs. She found thrip damage on a few early leaves. She found on the 6th of May a cluster of bean leaf beetle eggs on the underside of a leaf near the east end of the rows. Bean leaf beetles. She crouched and looked at the eggs, and then looked at the field, and then looked at the surrounding farms. The surrounding farms were full of soybeans. She drove into town that afternoon and stopped at the county extension office. Ted Mobley was in. "Ted," she said, "I want to talk to you about bean leaf beetle pressure this season." Ted leaned back in his chair. He was 38, earnest, genuinely committed to his work, but also the product of an agricultural extension system that was deeply embedded in conventional commodity crop management. He had limited experience with heirloom varieties. "We've had some mild aphid pressure," he said. "Nothing above threshold yet." "I'm not talking about aphids. I found bean leaf beetle eggs in my field, a lot of them. And I think the overwintering populations in the hedgerows along the South County Road are higher than normal." Ted looked at his computer. "I don't have any reports of elevated beetle populations. Because no one else is growing beans. If everyone else is growing soybeans, the beetles are there, but you won't see the egg damage. They prefer dry beans." Ted nodded. He was listening, but she could tell he was categorizing this as a small-scale operator concern. 40 acres of heirloom beans was not a county-level threat. "I'll keep an eye on it," he said. She thanked him and left. That evening she called Dr. Okafor. "Phil," she said, "tell me again about the beetle resistance." "The rattlesnake bean has significantly higher concentrations of certain phenolic compounds in its leaf tissue," Dr. Okafor said. "The compounds are bitter. Leaf beetles prefer to lay eggs on plants with lower phenolic content. They'll still feed on rattlesnake beans, but if given a choice, they choose modern varieties first. And if the modern varieties aren't there, Then they have no choice. A silence. But the real concern, Dr. Okafor continued, isn't the beetles themselves. It's that a high beetle population creates conditions for bacterial blight transmission. The beetles are vectors. They wound the plant and carry bacteria from plant to plant. And bacterial blight in soybean fields is devastating, Margaret said. Catastrophic would be the word I'd use. Margaret thanked her, hung up, and went to find Walter, growing and watching. By early June, the rattlesnake beans had done something Margaret had hoped for, but hadn't been entirely sure of. They had closed their canopy. The leaves of adjacent plants had grown together overhead, shading the soil between rows. This accomplished three things simultaneously. It reduced soil moisture evaporation, critical in what was proving to be a very dry June. It suppressed weed growth, eliminating the need for herbicide application or cultivation. And it created a microclimate in the rows, slightly cooler, slightly more humid than the open field, that was inhospitable to the spider mites that thrived in hot, dry conditions. Walter noticed this one morning and pointed it out to Margaret. "The rows are cooler," he said. She crouched and held her hand at soil level. The difference was noticeable, perhaps 5 degrees cooler under the canopy than in the open. "The old farmers knew this," she said. "That's why they planted intensively. Not just yield per plant, yield per square foot, and the microclimate management was part of it. Raymond soybeans are wide row this year," Walter said. "I saw from the road. 40-inch rows." "Wide rows in a dry year," she said, "is just inviting trouble." In the third week of June, Margaret started making notes in a small spiral-bound notebook that she kept in her shirt pocket. She noted the date, the weather, the soil moisture reading at 12 and 24 inches, any insect activity she found, and the condition of the plants in different sections of the field. She also started noting what she saw on the neighboring properties. June 18th, Dale Hutchins's soybeans, leaves beginning to show yellow mottling on east field, early signs of spider mite or possible iron deficiency. Hard to say from the road. June 22nd, drove past Raymond Price's south field. Plants look good overall, but canopy is very open. Soil looks dry on surface. He'll need rain or he'll be irrigating heavily. June 26th, found beanleaf beetle adults in the east hedgerow. Counted 14 in a 10-foot section. This is higher than I expected. Watched them for an hour. Most of them moved toward the soybean field across the road. Only 2 came into our rows. Both left after a few minutes. That last entry she circled twice. The beetles were preferring the soybeans. They were tasting the rattlesnake beans and leaving. The phenolic deterrents were working, but the soybean fields were getting hammered. She tried once more with Ted Mobley on June 28th. She brought the notebook. She showed him the beetle counts in the hedgerow. She showed him her observations about the neighboring fields. She explained the bacterial blight vector risk. Ted looked at the notebook seriously. He looked at her seriously. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, "I appreciate how thorough this is, I really do. But I want to be honest with you. Beanleaf beetles in soybeans are generally a manageable pest. We have good chemical control options and the economic threshold. What happens if the beetles carry bacterial blight into fields that are already moisture-stressed?" she said. "That's a worst-case scenario." "I know it is. Most years we don't see that scenario." "This isn't most years," she said. Ted looked at his window. "It's been dry," he conceded. "It's going to keep being dry," she said. "Look at the soil moisture reports. Look at the La Niña forecast. I've been reading Weather Service reports for 30 years from this county, and this summer is setting up exactly like 1988 and 2012. Ted nodded slowly. "I'll send out a notice to growers about monitoring." She thanked him. She knew a notice about monitoring was not the same as anyone actually changing anything. She went home and told Walter that they were on their own. "Were we ever not?" he said. The engineering of protection. It was in July that Walter and Margaret made the decision that, more than any other, determined what would happen in August. They had already done the planting right. The canopy closure was protecting the soil. The phenolic deterrents were discouraging the beetles. But Margaret had been thinking about a different problem. The beetles that did come into the field. They were few, but they were present. And if the adjacent soybean fields became heavily infested, if the beetle populations built to extraordinary levels under crisis conditions, the deterrence effect of the rattlesnake bean's leaf chemistry might not be enough. She brought this to Walter on the 2nd of July. "What if the beetle pressure gets so high that the chemical deterrent is overwhelmed?" she said. "If there are thousands of beetles per acre in the surrounding fields, even a small percentage finding our rows could cause significant damage." Walter thought about this. He walked the field perimeter twice. He looked at the hedgerows on the east and south sides, where buckthorn and osage orange grew in an old fence line that had been there since at least the 1940s. Then he came back and said, "Trap crops." Margaret looked at him. "We plant something the beetles can't resist between the hedgerow and the main field," he said. "Something that draws them in and concentrates them. Then we manage them there." "What draws bean leaf beetles better than anything?" "Blue Hubbard squash," he said immediately. "I remember reading about it years ago. They use it for cucumber beetle management, but the principle is the same. Beetles prefer certain plants. They'll go to the preferred plant first in overwhelming numbers." Margaret opened her laptop. They spent that evening researching. Walter was right. Trap cropping with highly preferred plant species was a legitimate and well-documented integrated pest management strategy. The key was to plant the trap crop before the main crop, so the pest populations built up there, and then to manage the trap crop, either with targeted insecticide application to the trap rows only, or by physically disrupting the trap crop before the pest reproduced. "We don't have Blue Hubbard squash," Margaret said. "No, but we've got time. The beetles are still mostly in the hedgerow stage. If we put in a fast-growing preferred crop along the east fence line, we might have 3 weeks before it needs to be managed." "What do we have seed for?" Walter went to the barn. He came back with a coffee can of old black-eyed pea seeds from 2015 and a paper bag of pole beans that were a different variety. A modern one, low phenolic content, that he'd been given at a field day 3 years ago and never planted. "The modern pole beans," he said. "They'll germinate fast this time of year. Low deterrence beetle magnets. We'd be sacrificing them deliberately." "Yes," Margaret nodded. 15 feet wide, along the entire east fence and the south fence. "And the corner," Walter added. "The corner is the entry point. I've been watching. That's where they come in." They planted the trap crop rows on July 5th. In the July heat, the modern pole beans germinated in 6 days. By the 12th of July, they were 6 inches tall and already showing the first signs of beetle feeding. Tiny round holes in the leaves, the characteristic feeding pattern of the bean leaf beetle adult. Walter and Margaret watched this development with the complex satisfaction of people who have set a trap and seen it spring. "They're going in," Walter said. "They are," Margaret said. "Now what?" "Now we count." Every morning for the next 10 days, Margaret walked the trap crop rows and counted adult beetles. She used a sweep net, a cloth bag on a metal hoop, swinging it through the trap crop plants 20 times and then counting what she caught. She recorded every count. July 14th, 18 beetles per 20 sweeps. July 16th, 31 beetles per 20 sweeps. July 19th, 47 beetles per 20 sweeps. July 21st, 63 beetles per 20 sweeps. July 23th, 89 beetles per 20 sweeps. The population was building fast, faster than she had expected, which meant the surrounding soybean fields were worse than they looked. She made a decision. On July 25th, she and Walter went to the local co-op and purchased 2 gallons of a contact insecticide. Not the systemic kind that would persist in the soil, but a fast-acting pyrethrin-based product derived from chrysanthemum flowers that would kill the beetles on contact and break down within days. They applied it to the trap crop rows only. Carefully, with backpack sprayers, not on the main field, not on the hedgerows, only on those 15-foot wide border strips where the beetle population had concentrated. The application took 4 hours. Walter swept the trap crop rows the following morning. 3 beetles per 20 sweeps. He stood in the morning heat and looked at the main field. The rattlesnake beans were waist-high now, full and heavy, covered in pods beginning to swell toward maturity. "One more planting of trap crop?" he said. "Yes," Margaret said, "but further out this time, along the county road. That's outside our property line. The county road right-of-way is public land. We can plant in the right-of-way." Walter looked at her. "And if anyone asks?" he said. "We're beautifying the roadside," she said. They planted the second trap crop strip on July 27th. The disaster arrives. The first official reports of widespread crop damage in Chase County came out of the Kansas Department of Agriculture on August 3rd. Spider mites had established at above-threshold populations in soybean fields across a 12-county area. The combination of extreme heat, low humidity, and drought stress, the exact conditions Margaret had predicted back in June, had created perfect mite reproduction conditions. A single female mite can produce hundreds of offspring in a week. Populations were doubling every 3 to 4 days, but that wasn't the worst of it. On August 7th, Ted Mobley drove out to Dale Hutchins's farm in response to a call about something going wrong with the beans, meaning the soybeans. He walked the field with Dale for an hour. He collected samples. He sent them to the K-State Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab. The results came back August 9th. Bacterial blight, Pseudomonas syringae PV, Glycinea, the same pathogen that Margaret had warned him about in June. Vectored by bean leaf beetles, whose populations had exploded in the July heat and spread from field to field along the county road corridors. The bacteria entered through the feeding wounds the beetles made in soybean leaves. From there, it spread through water, through the irrigation systems, through rainfall splash, through the dew that formed every morning in the low spots of the field. Once it was in a field, there was no chemical cure. There was only containment, and even that was difficult. Ted called the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture called the regional director. Within 48 hours, there were official damage assessments underway on 14 farms in Chase County. Dale Hutchins was looking at a 60% loss on his east field. Carol Freeman's corn had been destroyed by rootworm, a separate problem, but compounding the regional disaster. Raymond Price's sudden death syndrome, already devastating, had now spread to a second field. And then the mites found Raymond's healthy fields. Walter heard about it at the elevator on August 11th. He drove home and found Margaret in the field, moving through the rows with her clipboard. "Raymond's losing everything," he said. She kept walking. "I know. I talked to Carol this morning. Bacterial blight on top of sudden death. They're saying he might lose 60–70% of his total acreage. More," she said quietly. "If the mites get in, more." Walter looked at the rattlesnake beans around him. They were 10 weeks old now. The pods were full, heavy, hanging, streaked with purple and cream. The leaves were dark green and undamaged. The canopy was dense and cool. "They're going to need food," he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. "The county," he said. "Come fall. They're going to need food." She nodded slowly. "What's our yield looking like?" "Conservatively," she said, 18 to 22 bushels per acre on dry weight, on 18 acres. She did the arithmetic in her head. "Between 300 and 400 bushels, at current specialty dry bean prices, the heirloom market, we're looking at $1,200 to $1,800 per acre." Walter blinked. "Compared to commodity soybeans," he said. "Compared to commodity soybeans in a good year," she said, "we're coming out ahead. In this year, we're the only crop in the county." "Yes," she said, "we are." Harvest, late August 2018. The announcement that Chase County had been designated a federal agricultural disaster area came on August 17th. Margaret heard it on the kitchen radio while she was eating breakfast. She turned up the volume and sat still and listened to the whole report. Total projected losses in the county, between $40 and $60 million. Affected operations, over 200 farms. Major crops impacted, soybeans, corn. Estimated yield losses, soybeans 45–70%, corn 30–55%. She finished her coffee. She walked out to the field. It was a clear morning, the kind of hot, dry, cloudless morning that had been standard all summer, the kind of morning that had baked the other farms' fields into cracking dust. But under the canopy of the rattlesnake beans, the soil was still soft and dark. She dug her heel in. 3 inches down, moisture. 6 inches, moisture. The root system of the plants, which had driven down to 18 inches in their search for subsoil water, had been building a network of moisture retention channels for 4 months. She crouched at a plant and lifted a pod. It was firm and full, the seeds inside clearly differentiated, the skin tight. She counted the seeds through the pod wall. 7, 8 seeds per pod at this stage. She moved to the next plant. Same. The next. Same. She stood up and looked down the rows. Perfect. Row after perfect row of heavy producing plants, completely untouched by the disaster that had destroyed everything around them. For a long moment she just stood there, alone in the quiet of the early morning, while the world outside those rows was catastrophic. She allowed herself a moment of something that wasn't exactly pride, but was adjacent to it. The quiet satisfaction of having been right, of having done the work, of having made the seemingly foolish choice that wasn't foolish at all, but only appeared so to people who had forgotten the reason for it. Then she went back to the house to call Ashley and ask if she could come up from Wichita with friends to help with the harvest. They began harvesting on August 22nd. Ashley arrived with 3 friends from her graduate program, 2 men and another woman, none of whom had ever harvested anything by hand in their lives. Walter spent 2 hours that morning teaching them how to pull the pods without damaging the plants, how to check for maturity by feeling the seeds inside, how to work a row without doubling back. They harvested in the morning when it was cooler. They stopped in the midday heat. They went back in the late afternoon. Walter drove the old John Deere along the outside edge, towing a flatbed trailer where they loaded burlap bags of fresh pods. On the second day of harvest, Raymond Price drove past on the county road and slowed down. He pulled over and turned off his truck. He sat there for a while just watching. Then he got out and walked to the fence line. "Walter," he said. Walter stopped the tractor. "Raymond," a long silence. Raymond looked at the field, at the workers moving through the rows, at the bags of pods on the trailer, at the absolutely undamaged, completely producing plants. "How bad is it?" Walter asked. Raymond looked at the ground. "The south fields are gone. Both of them. Bacterial blight in one, mites finished the other." A pause. "I'm looking at maybe 30% of my projected yield on the whole operation." "I'm sorry," Walter said, and he meant it. "What is that?" Raymond said, nodding at the field. "Rattlesnake bean, heirloom variety. My grandfather grew it." "Why didn't the mites get in?" Walter looked at the canopy. "Canopy temperature, mites need heat and low humidity. The closed canopy drops the temperature under the leaves by 5 or 6 degrees. And the moisture in the soil, the deep root system holds water the mites need dry to thrive. Plus the leaf chemistry discourages the beetles that vector the blight." Raymond was quiet. "Why didn't the blight get in?" he said. "Because the beetles didn't get in. Because the beetles prefer low phenolic plants, and this variety has high phenolic content in its leaves. And we set up trap crop strips along the border that concentrated the beetle populations before they could enter the main field, and we treated those strips only." Raymond nodded slowly. He was a smart man. He understood what he was hearing. "You knew," he said. "You knew this was coming." "Margaret knew," Walter said. "She started watching in May." Raymond looked at the field for another long moment. "What are you doing with the beans?" "Selling dry weight to the specialty market. We've already got a buyer in Kansas City, a restaurant supply company. They want the whole crop. Heirloom beans for farm-to-table restaurants. They're paying—" "Don't tell me the price," Raymond said. Walter smiled. "Okay." Raymond put his hands in his pockets. "Could you get more seed for next spring?" "We'll have seed from this year's harvest," Walter said. "Plenty of it. Could you sell some to neighbors?" Walter looked at him for a long time. Raymond Price, who had said there comes a point where sentiment isn't management. Raymond Price, who had represented the opinion of the entire county at that February meeting, and at every meeting before it. "Yes," Walter said. "We could sell seed." The community shifts. By the end of the first week of September, the harvest was in. Ashley and her friends had picked every row. Walter had spread the pods to dry on tarps in the barn. Margaret had set aside the best seeds for the following year, marking which plants had produced the most, which pods had been fullest, which individuals had shown the most vigor in the worst heat. This was the same thing her husband's grandfather had done every year for 20 years, and his father before him, selecting the strongest, saving the best, building, generation by generation, a variety that could survive. The word spread through Cottonwood Falls faster than it had in February, but this time the tone was different. Carol Freeman called on a Wednesday evening. She asked if she could come by and see the field. Margaret said yes. Carol drove out the next morning and walked the harvested rows in silence, looking at the soil, the root channels left by the pulled plants, the general health of what remained. "Can you show me those seed packets?" she said. Margaret brought out the labeled envelopes. The seeds she'd saved sorted by plant. Carol picked one up and held it. "My grandmother grew heirloom beans," she said. "A lot of grandmothers did," Margaret said. "I thought they were, I don't know, old-fashioned. I thought modern varieties were just better." "Modern varieties are better at certain things," Margaret said. "Better for mechanical harvesting, better for consistent appearance, better for long-distance shipping. But better at surviving a drought year in a beetle pressure situation? No. The modern varieties were never bred for that. They were bred for yield in good conditions." Carol looked at the field again. "What happens in a bad year when you only have plants bred for good conditions?" "This," Margaret said quietly, "this happens." Ted Mobley came by on a Friday. He brought a graduate student from K-State who was studying the county's crop losses. He had a clipboard and a camera, and the slightly chastened expression of a man who has reviewed his own notes and found a record of a conversation he wished had gone differently. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't," she said. "You were working from the information you had. You gave me information I should have acted on." She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "I did. But the extension system is built around what works for the majority of operations under standard conditions. What I was describing wasn't standard. You made a reasonable professional judgment." "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. "Write it up. Document what happened here. Not for me, for the next person who comes into your office with an old seed variety and a bunch of handwritten field notes and a warning you haven't heard before." He nodded. He did write it up. The K-State Extension System published a case study the following spring. Raymond Price came by the last week of September. He came alone in the late afternoon when the light was golden and long. He parked in the driveway and knocked on the door, and Margaret brought him in and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table where Walter's grandfather had inoculated seeds in 1936. "I want to learn," Raymond said. "Not just the beans, the whole approach, the trap cropping, the canopy management, the soil monitoring." "It takes time," Walter said. "I've got time. I've got nothing else this fall." Margaret pushed a notebook across the table. "Start here," she said. It was her field notes from the entire season, the daily observations, the beetle counts, the soil moisture readings, the weather records, the calls with Dr. Okafor. Raymond picked it up and started reading. He was there for 3 hours. By the time he left, the notebook was full of his own notes in the margins. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Walter. "I said some things in February," he said. "You did," Walter agreed. "I was wrong." "You had company," Walter said. "Half the county was wrong with you." Raymond put his hat on. "Half the county lost their shirts this summer." "Yes," Walter said. "They did." A pause on the porch. "I'm thinking about calling Phyllis Okafor at K-State," Raymond said. Margaret mentioned her. "She's worth calling," Walter said. "She spent her whole career studying exactly this kind of thing. Seeds that don't fit the modern model. Plants that were engineered by farmers over centuries for conditions like we had this year. Why doesn't anyone use them?" Raymond said. "Because in good years the modern varieties yield more. And in bad years." Walter looked out at his field. The soil was resting now, alive with the nitrogen fixed by 3 months of bean roots, softer and darker than it had been in 15 years. "In bad years," he said, "the old ways are the only ways." Cottonwood Falls, March 2019. The February extension meeting is standing room only this year. 47 people in a room with 30 chairs, extra chairs borrowed from the Sunday school room, people standing against the walls. Ted Mobley isn't showing a PowerPoint tonight, he's introducing a speaker. Margaret Jenkins stands up at the front of the room. She's wearing the same denim shirt she harvests in, and she has a cardboard box at her feet. She doesn't have notes. She talks for 40 minutes. She talks about her grandfather-in-law's farm in 1931 and the Dust Bowl decisions that turned that farm from ruin to survival. She talks about the hybrid revolution of the 1960s and what was gained, yield, consistency, scale, and what was quietly lost, the genetic memory of 10,000 years of farmers selecting for resilience. She talks about phenolic compounds in leaf tissue and root depth, and canopy microclimate, and nitrogen fixation. She talks about trap cropping and border management and daily field observation. She talks about the difference between a farm built to perform under ideal conditions and a farm built to survive under all conditions. She talks about her notebook. She holds it up. Everything I did this year, she says, I wrote down. Every day, every observation, every decision, and why I made it. The K-State Extension Office has a copy. It'll be available to anyone who wants it. Nobody laughs, nobody snickers. Raymond Price, sitting in the front row with a legal pad on his knee, has been writing continuously since she started speaking. I want to say one more thing, Margaret says, and I say this not to embarrass anyone because I understand why we got here. Modern agriculture is an extraordinary achievement. It feeds more people than anything in human history. But it was built on the assumption that conditions would remain relatively stable, that we'd have roughly the same rainfall we've always had, roughly the same pest pressures, roughly the same disease environments. When those assumptions break down, she pauses, you need something older, something that was built not by scientists for ideal conditions, but by farmers over centuries for every condition, including the impossible ones. She bends down to the cardboard box. She starts pulling out small paper envelopes. Rattlesnake bean seed, she says. 2 ounces per envelope. First-generation selection from our 2018 harvest. The strongest plants, the fullest pods, the best root development. She sets them on the table at the front. Free, 1 envelope per farm, with the condition that you save seed from your best plants this year and share what you learn. There is a line of people to the table before she finishes the sentence. Raymond Price is the last person to take an envelope. He holds it in both hands for a moment and looks at it. This small paper envelope containing, if he counted, perhaps 40 seeds, each one the size of a pea, each one carrying in its genetic code the accumulated selections of farmers going back a century or more. He looks up at Margaret. What do I do first? He says. She smiles. Get your soil tested, she says. Then start reading your field. Every morning, before it gets hot. Look at what's there. Not just the crop, but the insects, the soil surface, the leaves. Look at the hedgerows. Look at what the birds are doing. Learn to read the signs. And if I see something wrong, write it down, she says, and call me. He nods. He tucks the envelope into his chest pocket, buttons it closed and puts his hand over it for a moment, like he's making sure something precious won't fall out. Then he puts his hat on and walks out into the March wind. Outside, the fields are still winter bare. The highway runs straight and empty toward the horizon, but in Raymond Price's chest pocket, and in 46 other pockets in that church basement, something is beginning again. Something that was almost lost, nearly forgotten, briefly laughed at. Something that was right all along. Writer's notes on the rattlesnake bean. This is a real heirloom variety, Phaseolus vulgaris, with documented history in North American agriculture. Its pest deterrence properties, deep root system, and drought tolerance are consistent with the characteristics described in this script. The variety nearly disappeared during the 20th century hybrid seed revolution and is actively preserved by seed conservation organizations. On bacterial blight, Pseudomonas syringae PV. Glycinia is a real pathogen that affects soybeans. Bean leaf beetles are documented vectors. The interaction between drought stress, beetle populations, and bacterial blight transmission described in this script is consistent with established plant pathology literature. On trap cropping, the use of preferred host plants to concentrate pest populations before managed destruction is a well-documented integrated pest management strategy used across multiple crops. On rhizobium inoculation, standard practice in legume agriculture for nitrogen fixation, exactly as described. The 2012 and 1988 comparisons Margaret makes are to real catastrophic drought years in the Kansas Plains region.